All right, we are now at the final part of our weekend in our program, and we are going to finish with our program that's entitled Creating Action with Information, the Rare Disease Community. And Dr. Cary Harding is going to share with us. Some of you have talked with him this weekend. He has some great information and just a little bit of background about him. Dr. Harding is an associate professor in the Department of Molecular and Medical Genetics and Pediatrics at Oregon Health and Science University, or OHSU. He received his medical degree from the University of Washington, followed by pediatric and medical genetics training at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's board certified in pediatrics, clinical genetics, and biochemical genetics. Dr. Harding is a founding fellow of the American College of Medical Genetics. He's an attending physician at the OHSU Clinical Genetics Service, as well as in both genetics clinic and the metabolic clinic at Dornbecker Children's Hospital. He is the medical director of the Biochemical Genetics Lab and the Knight Diagnostic Laboratories at OHSU. He's also a clinical consultant to the Northwest Regional Newborn Screening Program and to the State of Idaho Genetics Program. Dr. Harding's basic and clinical research programs are focused upon the development of novel therapies, including gene and cell therapies for inborn errors of metabolism. So if you would help me in joining him, and he will close our program out today. Thank you.
He's got it up here. Okay. I'm running it off of there. And I fold paper bags in my spare time. But thanks for that very nice introduction. I am extremely honored to be asked to give this. Although when I got the title, I was like, I could talk about anything. But hopefully I can put something together. First off, I want to apologize. I had a little illness issue last night, so I am heartbroken actually that I missed the dinner and all of that last night, which I am still very upset about. Anyway, so my title, Creating Action with Information in the Rare Disease Community. And you've seen these disclosures before. And these are my take-home messages. I think the future for PKU research and treatment is extremely bright. It may seem bewildering to some of you, all the different directions that people are going, but I think this is a good thing because we don't know what's going to ultimately be the best. And I don't think there will be one thing that's best for everybody. So having options is great. One key take-home message is that the barriers that we face to getting anything new sort of out there and approved is shared by a lot of disorders, not just PKU. And I think there's safety in numbers, so joining with other organizations could do nothing but be helpful. And I'll show you both in the research world, but also at the sort of legislative end of things that collaborative efforts are absolutely critical. There's a little bit of a shift in the research world. It used to be that there was this individual competition, which there still is for grants, and not sharing data because you might get scooped and all of that. And there's still a little bit of that, but I have to say it's becoming harder and harder and harder to get funded unless you're in sort of a team effort. And those things are much more favorably looked upon now, and I think that's been a good thing. And the absolute most important take-home message is that patient advocates, patients, parents, groups that they form have immense amounts of impact at the policy level, much more so than the self-interested researcher like myself. So I think NPQA can really have an immense impact. So it's all about teamwork. And I was sort of, yesterday or the day before, I was on this whole Olympic theme, and yesterday was the Olympic road race and for cycling, and no one wins a road race without their team behind them, and the whole team sacrifices themselves for the ultimate goal. And this is the British team on the front who was riding with the express goal of getting Mark Cavendish to the finish line. Of course, this analogy only worked so far because they didn't. It ended up being an individual effort that won. So I then also think about the fact that individuals can make a great deal of influence in and of themselves, and individual efforts are obviously key to the entire teamwork package. So I'm going to talk a little bit about future treatments, which we've talked about, a little bit more about what we need, what the sort of current questions are with our ongoing therapy, and then a little bit about legislative and regulatory issues. So future therapy, I've just listed some things. There's probably other things in development that I don't know about. All of these things you've heard about some, and I find all of them extremely promising and worthwhile to be investigated. And I want to talk about PAL-PEG as an example of how collaborative efforts are needed. We've heard from Dr. Prasad that, you know, BioMarin has this trial, but this has been going on for a really long time, and there are a lot of people in many places that have been involved in this, and I really want to kind of go through what this took. So Christina Sarkisian, who is still at McGill University in Canada, was really the person to push doing PAL-PEG. In fact, this idea has existed since the 70s. And there were some animal experiments tried early on by other people that just didn't come to fruition. But in fact, Christina has gone back to that original approach and is still doing lab work in her lab to try to come up with an oral form, basically, of PAL-PEG, because right now what we have is injectable. Ray Stevens at the Scripps Institute took this. They highly modified this protein to try to make it a better drug. Spent immense amount of effort on this. And they finally picked what they thought was the best product. And then with BioMarin's help, there was a very large animal study done to show that that particular drug worked well. That was done at the University of Florida with, blanked on his first name, Dr. Lapis, was the PI down there. And then finally, we get to this clinical trial, first in human trial that was initially at 7 centers and has expanded a little bit beyond that. So I hope Dr. Prasad didn't show this, but this is where we're actually at. So there have been about 40 people now who have gotten PAL-PEG, and everybody has needed a little bit of a different dose to get there, but every single individual has been able to reach a decrease in their Phe levels by taking these injections of PAL. And this is the average data, dropping from, on average, about 1,200, 1,300 micromolar down to around or below 600, which was the target. But there are some individuals for where this has worked immensely well, where their Phe levels have basically gone to 0. So this is extremely gratifying, but we still have a ton of work to do and to study this, and that's where phase 3 comes in. They're expanding sites. They want to get more patients. At this point, it's adults that have high Phe levels, so basically are not doing their dietary therapy very well. And the goal of this really is to ultimately prove that this drug is efficacious. Unlike Kuvan, there are side effects, and these are the things that we need to learn how to manage and what the long-term consequences are. So I just want to point out that there's still a tremendous amount of work that's been, that still needs to happen in phase 3. So what was the timeline of this? Well, as I mentioned, the first experiments with PAL-PEG started back in the 70s, but Christina published her first paper back in 1999, and here we are in 2012, and we're planning phase 3 for 2013, and who knows when we would get to FDA approval. It's a hugely long process. And then this, and I'm not, at this point, although everybody talks about the regulatory sort of barriers and how long it takes to get through clinical trial, and there is some of that, but this scientifically has just literally taken this great length of time to be able to get to this optimal drug. And the funding has come from a very wide group of resources. And I think that's key, and I think this is very much very typical for trying to get novel therapies to the market. We face exactly the same thing in preclinical studies with even a little bit bigger regulatory hurdle. And I've been working very hard to develop a preclinical vector that is something that we can use in animals but is not legal to use in humans, and we can prove that this will work. And we're at the stage now of trying to refine the vector, make it work better. And if we find a candidate that we're really happy with, then we will go to the FDA to get what's called an investigational new drug application. But then there's a lot of work that has to start that's actually sort of difficult to get funding for. You have to do a tremendous amount of validation of that product in animals to make sure that it's safe before we would ever finally get to a human phase 1 clinical trial. And that last part takes 3-4 years and several $1 million to get to where you've got enough safety information that the FDA would actually let you inject this into a human. And I don't have a slide on this, but I want to go back and give tremendous tribute to those individuals who have and will participate in clinical trials, especially with PEG-PAL. I mean, it was kind of a major milestone in my lifetime to be able to inject a drug that had never been given into a human. I thought it would be fine and that there would, it wouldn't be lethal, but we didn't really know. And so the patient who stepped up to take that risk, I really can't imagine how much of a step that was, and I really applaud their contributions to the whole research. And this is just to point out that, again, we're still tweaking our vectors and trying to make them better, and something that I think will work in a human. And this takes a ton of people to do this, and it will take a lot more people in a lot of different labs in a lot of different countries. So I've been very fortunate in working with an extremely good group of people at a variety of institutions around the world, and fortunately I've been able to keep the funding coming. So let's switch a little bit. So that's the future of research, but there's still a lot we don't understand about the effects of current therapy and the pathophysiology of PKU. So it's still not clear now, whatever it is, 90 years after the discovery of this disease, exactly what phenylalanine does to the brain. We have information about it, but I can't give you a unifying theory as to why phenylalanine damages the brain, and we really need to look at that in much more detail. And this is absolutely not a complete list of questions, but we've heard about micronutrients, we've heard about intact protein versus free amino acids and what the benefits are. This bone problem, we've heard about that, and all of these things need to be looked at, neuropsychological outcomes, and then again the pathophysiology of PKU. And this is a slide from a Belgian group that just lists a variety of different possibilities for why phenylalanine might be a problem in the brain, and it may be that they all do. It may be contributions from multiple areas, but this is a place that is ripe for further investigation. Fortunately, we have an animal model that will help us with this. We can do investigations in the brain that we can't do in a human. We're definitely working towards that end, but I very much am interested, I don't do so much of it myself, but extremely interested in the neuropsychologic and the imaging studies that are going on, and they're coming out with newer imaging techniques that don't just look at structure of the brain, but they actually can look at the chemistry of the brain. So when we say the dopamine is low, because we can grind up a mouse brain and see that the dopamine is low, maybe we'll have a non-invasive way of actually measuring that in a person with PKU and then changing their treatment and see how that's affected. We're not quite there yet, but that's kind of the thing I've been hoping can be developed. And then this whole issue of being able to track people long-term. And so we have isolated pockets of this with the post-marketing studies for QVAN, for instance, for the registry that they have for the use of QVAN in maternal PKU. And so we have these databases open where people can contribute information, and we will learn over time what the long-term outcomes would be with regards to QVAN therapy, but we don't have that for the entire patient population as a whole. And I've mentioned in the past, there have been collaborative studies that were very large that went for 18 years or so and then were terminated, but then that was all children, and we don't have much more information about what happened to them as an adult, and I think that's extremely important. So that there have been some recent efforts on this, and both the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and the FDA have become very interested in rare disorders research. And for the first time last year, I actually saw all of them in the same room together, which was a novel outcome. So they're sort of starting to talk the common language. One of the things that's happened at NIH is they pulled several programs from different institutes. And the institutes at NIH have been mostly sort of disease, system targeted. So in other words, there's a National Institute for Neurologic Disorders. And there's a National Institute for Kidney Disease and Liver Disease, and there's a National, Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. But PKU and mostly other rare metabolic diseases, they affect lots of those systems. So what NIH has actually done under the direction of the director, Francis Collins, who's a geneticist, they've set up a new center called the National Center for Advancing Translational Studies. And within that, they have moved the Office for Rare Disease Research. And so hopefully this will give more of a global sort of approach to looking at outcomes in rare diseases. And the FDA has an analogous Office of Orphan Products Development. So an orphan disease is one that has fewer patients in the world than high blood pressure, for instance. There's a specific definition for what's an orphan disease. And the FDA has, for a long time now, had an office devoted to trying to get studies through faster for these orphan diseases. And they're, again, starting to work together, the FDA and the NIH, a little bit more. And we've had 2 meetings in the last 12 months. We had one in December 2011 that was specifically put together by NIH and FDA to look at what were the pockets of ignorance, if you will, with regards to the effects of dietary therapy and all of the metabolic disorders and what areas needed to be filled in. And I think this will translate into specific requests by the NIH for research proposals to get money to do some of these comparative studies. And then they held a very large meeting in February, which I was honored to be able to present at, specifically on what were the research needs in PKU. And that is going to definitely translate into specific requests from NIH for specific proposals for what to do for all of these areas of research in PKU. I want to switch a little bit to what's happened in a couple of other diseases. This does not exist for PKU, but there are several rare disorders that have intact research programs that are national and actually multinational. That's what we're called the Rare Disorders Consortia or Rare Disease Consortia. Most of these are NIH funded, that's their base, but in the case of the one that I work with, mostly the urea cycle defects, there's actually a tremendous amount of philanthropic money that's been raised by the patient advocacy group to even expand the protocol even further, and I think this collaboration has been extremely useful. At the base of all of these rare disorders consortia, there is a longitudinal natural history study, which is we collect data on patients with your consent. It's all anonymous, but it's just clinical information. Every time you come to clinic, there's nothing extra added to the visit, except it allows us to put your growth data and your neuropsych data and lab data into a larger database. And we have no upfront question. It's just we're collecting data, and then we go back and we look at the data in aggregate and try to see if there are trends or specific concerns, specific areas that we can generate hypotheses on and then go in and research specifically. And these consortia require collaboration from multiple different groups. If you don't go in with a proposal that has all of these people involved, they won't even look at us for a specific to get funded. So I've had a fair amount of experience now with the Urea Cycle Disorders Consortia, and some of the other metabolic docs in the room who do PKU have also been involved in this. And we're up to 16 centers now, 2 of which are in Europe. So this is a good thing because, for better or worse, there have been differences in practice that have just developed between us and them. And collecting the data, we can sort of, without saying I want to do a specific study and compare Heidelberg to Philadelphia, we can just collect all of the data and look to see, is one group in some area doing better than another, and why might that be? And that comes down to the longitudinal study, which is really looking at effectiveness of current therapy. And just 2 of the examples that have come out of that are papers that we're working on are, in fact, that the dogma in these urea cycle disorders was that your liver wasn't very sick, but that doesn't turn out to be very true. And in fact, that we're now finding even liver cancer developing in adults with some of these diseases. So now we have the data. Everybody has had, oh, I had a case of liver cancer in a patient, and somebody else had, oh yeah, I had one too. But now we can actually look across at least all of these centers and say, how many patients did we actually have that ended up having liver tumors? And it turns out to be not insignificant. So there was anecdotal reports of this, but it's becoming very clear. And I'm just using this as an example to show you how valuable these sort of longitudinal studies can be in finding out information that was suspected but maybe not widely appreciated. We have several sub-trials in this that are funded by pharmaceutical companies developing new drugs, and they're very major partners in this consortium, and they come to the meetings and they give presentations on their data, and they listen to our suggestions, they listen to the patient's suggestions about what to do next. And the patient organization there is the National Urea Cycle Disorders Foundation, and they have a direct seat at the table. Their executive director is on the executive directorship of this consortium, and nothing gets done without passing past that organization. So we don't have a big database for PKU. And there was talk at NIH about maybe we should put together one specifically. And I don't have any, I think that would be a good thing, but even if we can't get specific funding for that, I think there's a broader effort that we can probably tag onto, and that's called the Newborn Screening Translational Research Network. So this came out of the fact that they started, as you've heard earlier, we expanded the number of diseases that we can screen for on newborn screening, but there was a big concern that we really needed to learn what the outcome was going to be. And rather than have that done in individual screening centers, that it was better to have this data from lots of different places. So it's not open yet, but there's been a lot of work on developing a national database, a very large one, collecting longitudinal clinical data on patients who have been found to have disorders detected by newborn screening. PKU obviously is the prototype for that. So although the goal, I think, in that whole initial effort was to track disorders that we didn't have very much information about, much less than PKU, I think it's I think it will be very possible to use this database and put in information about PKU patients and then use that as the basis for us to be able to go back and look at some of these large population outcomes. And so that may not be what ends up happening, but that's what I've been pushing at the NIH, is to take advantage, because they're spending millions on developing the software and the database and where is it going to be housed and who's going to take care of it, and it literally takes $10 or $15 million to do that. So if they do it and we can use it, that's sort of where I've been trying to get the Office of Rare Disorders to put their efforts. Last subject I want to talk about is near and dear to everybody's heart, and that's getting medical foods paid for. And I haven't had so much direct effort on this. There have been many people in the country who worked very hard on this issue, including people from NPQA and other rare disorder organizations. In our place, Kathleen Huntington and Neil Bust, my predecessor, have done a lot of politicking over the years. And we're fortunate in Oregon because we have a state mandate, a piece of legislation that requires insurance companies to pay for both formula and medical foods throughout life, including adulthood. They still fight us, but we just send them the letter from the Attorney General, and then they usually comply. And as you heard earlier, and Christine Brown has been, helping a tremendous amount trying to get this Medical Foods Equity Act pushed, which is probably going nowhere unless Congress changes its composition. But there might be a backdoor way to this. And we're working on it really hard in Oregon. So under Obamacare, they're setting up these insurance exchanges for people who don't have another type of insurance, any other insurance available to them. You'd be able to go into this insurance exchange, presumably buy an insurance policy. What's being done right now in every state in the country is they're defining the list of benefits that are required under that plan. Because of our mandate, our existing mandate, the language that I just saw definitely includes coverage of both medical formulas and the low-protein food products. The language gets a little hazy with regards to adults. So I know Kathleen and Neil are, I just saw emails yesterday about influencing them to make sure that the language is very much more clear that this needs to be a lifelong thing. But my experience recently has been, so let's take the state of Idaho as an example. Idaho does not have an insurance mandate. I'm not happy with PKU care there, even though I go and see all these patients. I haven't given up on them. They don't have an insurance mandate. Adults get nothing, and they're basically just cut out to the wind. The kids get formula and actually medical foods paid for by the state. It's actually federal dollars that flow through the state. The state contributes nothing. But they have a limited amount of money, and a couple of years ago they just said, okay, the adults are off. And I figured, well, then we're in a complete disaster mode here. We're not going to get any coverage. But it turns out that for some of the individuals who had insurance and the ones who got on Medicaid, surprisingly, Medicaid covered it. And I can basically order, at least the formula, foods are a bigger question, but formula, I can basically prescribe for them any amount that they need. And CMS, which is the organization that sets the benefits for Medicaid, has been paying. And because of that, which was a big surprise that that would happen to me, but because of that, some of the other insurers have just fallen in line. Not all of them have, but some of them just say, well, whatever CMS does, we'll do. And I think exactly the same thing will happen with these rules under these health insurance exchanges. So rather than trying to push through which I still think that ought to be done to keep pushing this act, but I think we might be able to get to the same place without having to go to that level of effort. And what I want to point out a little bit about that, I should give you a little bit more history about the foods law in Oregon. I say we passed this. The families passed this. And that's where places like individuals like yourselves and the organization, NPQA, can have huge impact. So, you know, we helped write, I didn't, Kathleen Huntington helped write the language of the law. And we go down to the legislature and testify at subcommittees. And I go down and give my little blurb about this is what PKU is, and this is what the treatment is, and this is absolutely critical and has to be done for life. But what makes the biggest impact by far and away is then the line of patients that we have come up, including now college graduates who've been on diet, you know, their whole life, who get up there and tell these congressmen their case. And usually by the end of the thing, there aren't any dry eyes in the room. And it's a done thing. So newborn screening legislation, for instance, is the only legislation in Oregon that has ever passed through without any negative votes. Whether it, you know, we've had Republicans, Democrats in control at various times, those things just sail. But it sails because the families go in and they give their testimony, and it's obvious to everybody on the committee that it would be a tragedy to do anything to not allow screening. And then ultimately, it's a little bit more of a push, but we've been fairly successful getting them to agree that we need to be able to treat. If you're going to screen, you need to be able to treat for the entire life of the patient. So again, it's the patient efforts that have really sold that. We look, for better or worse, like we're just serving ourselves if I get up there and say, I really want you guys to pay for the therapy that I prescribe, but it's the families that really demonstrate to them how critical this is. So my conclusions, things are very promising, but collaboration is essential, and it has to come from lots of different places, both effort and funding. And so what's the critical catalyst to this whole effort? That would be you, and what I mean by you is really NPQA, and I thank you for allowing me to speak today.